This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hello and welcome back to Exvangelical. I'm your host Blake Chastain. On today's show, my guest is Stephen Jones. He tells a very personal, very moving story of his own experience growing up within evangelicalism, the family struggles he's faced, and the process of dismantling and reconstructing or rediscovering a healthy sense of self and of faith during his time at Christian college and the years thereafter. Now, without priming you too much, this episode is very different than episode 1. Whereas episode 1 was acerbic and cynical, Stephen's story is redemptive and full of hope. He shares about his doubt about reconciling rational skepticism with intuitive belief, and also about his engagement within the mystical tradition, the last of which is the basis of an experience that he shares near the end of the interview that is worthy of the word revelation. It's a very different type of experience than the one that is often found within evangelicalism, and the very reason that I want to share such diverse stories. I hope you're encouraged by Stephen's story. I know I was. Now let's get into it. We could go a couple of different ways. I could just kind of open it up to you and let you sort of respond. If we wanted to have more of a conversation, we can kind of start at our similar starting point, which again is really just our alma mater. But that's that we didn't know each other very well in college, actually. So
that might be a good place to start.
Yeah,
we really didn't. But we, in some ways, we ran in similar circles.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, there was like a Venn diagram of like people that we had in common. There were like similar people that my roommate was a good friend of yours, as well as his older brother and everything. We absolutely ran in similar circles. I took religion classes, mostly like Greek classes, and you were in the philosophy department. So there was a lot of, there was definitely, we ran into each other a lot for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, we did.
So let's talk a little bit about, tell me a little bit about what, led you there to Christian college and what set you on that. Because I think, a lot of people that would be listeners probably have a similar experience at a Christian college or a Christian high school or whatever else. But I do think for a lot of people there is an element of choice. For some people there isn't. But what led you to our college?
That's an interesting story because I had actually earned free rides to several good schools, including one private school, and I didn't expect it. My teachers told me I was an idiot for turning them down, but I seriously applied to one school, and I was accepted, and that's where I went. And I'm not sure exactly why. When I think back on it, why did I just choose the one school? And I don't think I have a good answer for it. I could reduce it to something as simple as they had a display at, a summer camp, like a family camp at the campground, not like a youth thing. And I saw it and I liked it and decided that's where I would go. But I don't think that is a satisfactory explanation. I'm always a little uncomfortable, maybe very uncomfortable, talking about ideas like providence. But if I'm being honest, I think that I was led there. I think that I arrived at a very particular time and encountered a very particular set of people, and it changed my life. So even though I'm loath to admit that I think that there was some divine, involvement in that process, I kind of have to admit that I really do think that way.
And that's a absolutely legitimate response. I wouldn't. I mean, for as much as this podcast is called Exvangelical, it's that title is targeted towards a particular type of belief, not necessarily not really espousing a lack of belief. That's kind of
No, absolutely.
It's not. So yeah, I wouldn't discredit that at all.
No, and I don't think that a lot of people do. I think that a lot of people who aren't particularly religious are still open to that idea of calling or being led or having a sense of purpose. I personally am very uncomfortable with it. That's part of my religious baggage is a sensitivity to the spiritual and the divine, and being honest about that with people. That's a challenge for me.
Mm-hmm. So what about before? I mean, you got high marks, or you got full ride offers and everything prior to selecting our school. What was like your first encounter or experience within evangelicalism? I know that's kind of like that's intentionally vague. So
right. Well, I'm a bit of a cradle evangelical, I guess. I grew up in a nominally Wesleyan church, previously Pilgrim Holiness, so very, very conservative. Pilgrim Holiness would have been, by today's standards, considered fundamentalist, but merged into the Wesleyan camp, moderated their positions a bit, but some of that old energy was still around. And in this particular church, it was a strange and sometimes dark energy, but still nominally evangelical and moving that direction over the years. So I was born right into it.
Okay, yeah, and so you were born into it. Did you have was your family a regular attenders or things like that, or was it a family connection there? I mean, you said you were born into it, so
right.
That implies family. But every family dynamic is pretty unique. So what? If this is too personal, you let me know.
So honestly, this whole thing is going to be pretty personal for me. These things cut at the root of my whole story. Family, the way family and religion dovetail in my life is pretty significant. On one hand, my mom's family had been a part of that church, and the regional church for generations. I mentioned the camp earlier. My great grandfather on that side helped to build the big tabernacle there. I was there every year with my grandparents for family camp. For a couple years as a teenager, I was there in the summer for like youth camps. And as is often the case with small churches like that, it's comprised of, two families basically. And my family was one of those. However, that being said, my mom was not particularly religious, at least in overt ways. She knew things. Religious language and ideas would color her behavior and how she would speak, but I never got a sense that she was practicing or devotionally Christian. My dad, who had married into the church and didn't feel any particular connection to it, was actually very devotional in faith, kind of a homespun, you know, farm wisdom kind of religion. But he meant every word of it. And so those clashing dynamics fought themselves out in me. Um, so yeah, I mean, my parents in particular, not really so religious in overt ways, but the rest of the family was. And they weren't exactly models, like a model Christian family either. There was a ton of dysfunction, but man, they were at church every Sunday. And, the time when I brought cards with me because I was bored, my grandmother just slapped them right out of my hand, so they knew the rules very well.
Okay. Yeah. So during that time, I mean, it sounds like you, just even from your recollection, it sounds like you were paying attention. You were a kid that was watching the adults around them and everything, and as well as what was being taught from the pulpit. What did you think of the way what the church taught back then, and about the people even outside of your family, within your group or your church family, so to speak?
I have to say that most of the time, what was taught was not very substantial. The pastors I had when I was young were not good preachers. They were nice guys, and they cared about people, but I never got the sense that they were bringing any kind of fire to it, So in Sunday school classes, I would engage pretty heavily. I would want to know more. I would ask questions, or more likely than not, I would try to know all the answers before I got there, because I was that kid. And so I was pretty young the first time my pastor pulled me aside and asked me if I'd considered becoming a pastor, because I knew all the answers. I knew stuff, and that itself was remarkable in that church, because the people just didn't really know so much. I think they probably could have handled more, but it was never given to them. Pastors didn't push that. On the other hand, the popular energy, the popular piety in the congregation, could be very severe and very dark. There wasn't a lot of theology around it, but there was a strong sense of what the gospel meant, and the gospel was generally that everything's falling apart. You can escape the crumbling world if you're lucky. The good news was a very dark good news. You know what I mean?
Was that being given to what was that? What was the congregation like, socially or economically? Like what station were the people in that were receiving that message?
The congregation, generally speaking, was an aging congregation, but at least by the time I left, there was still a range of ages there. So they weren't like a solely, elderly congregation, but generally speaking, that's where things were moving, and so many of the families had been middle class, but had also been retired for so long that middle class stops losing its meaning, in certain forms of retirement. And but not all of them were. There were several families who lived in poverty, and mine was one. Mine was probably the most severe poverty in the church.
And do you think that impacted how you interpreted things, and how that message of things are dark but you can escape through faith? Yeah. How did that play out in what you're able to see and for you?
That's a really great question. In that I'm having to actually think it through. I was not conscious of these dynamics at the time. However, when I look back on that period of my life, part of the growing sense I had about the condition of the congregation I was in had to do with this the illusory nature of their religious views, right? What I mean by that is they believed things were the way they were because that's the religious culture that they had inherited. That told them how the world was, so they didn't look at the world for what it was. They didn't see anything about the world outside the way they were expected to find the world, right? So, I mean, I'm coming to that church out of a pretty broken place my whole childhood. My mom was severely mentally ill. We were living in poverty. So when I was told the world was a dark place, I would say, well, sure, there's darkness all around me, but I'm a pretty happy guy. And by the way, what the hell is wrong with you people? Because you've actually got it pretty nice. What are you complaining about? I had a real problem with the way that they would play into remnant theology. Remnant theology is it's theology of the oppressed. It's by the oppressed for the oppressed. These are people who, bad things are happening to them, and the message of that of remnant theology is maybe only a few of us will survive this, but the few who survive will rebuild. This evil that is befalling us will not crush us, right? That's empowering for people who are truly suffering. But when you put that theology in the hands of people who aren't suffering, then they play the victim. They become complacent and lazy. They blame other people for what's going wrong in the world. They lack a certain kind of introspection that helps them see what's actually going on with themselves. I mean, remnant theology in the hands of privileged people is a horrible, horrible thing. Was that too much?
No, that was great. No, I think that's right on. So I mean, just kind of jumping from that. I mean, did the church attendance and everything else, did you continue to attend church throughout your teenage years and all that sort of stuff? Was there an active youth group culture at your church or at another church that you went to or anything like that? Because I think that's a formative period for young people in general, that period of adolescence and that period of education, and also where you have peers which from my experience in a youth group, a very strong youth group, was you kind of have your peers teaching you and like forming each other, even though that might not be the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
But what was your experience like at that point in your life?
It was really kind of chaotic, I think. There wasn't a place for me to be. When I was offered places to be, I struggled to feel like I could actually fit there. And honestly, part of that is just my personality. Um, I tend to feel like I'm an outsider wherever I'm at. Right? I identify most with whatever group I'm not a part of at the moment.
Yeah.
So I'm always defending whoever's not there. I'm always criticizing the people I'm with. But in a different situation, I'd be defending those people.
Yeah, I have a similar tendency. I identify. So
yeah, so I can't really blame the groups or the options that were given to me. I was just a little bit of a curmudgeon. Well, no, now I'm a little bit of a curmudgeon. At the time, I was probably a real pain at everyone's ass. My congregation was in pretty serious decline through my high school years, and I actually remember at one point, like, confronting the leaders of my church and saying, "Hey, have you noticed that this is a problem? Have you noticed that people are, they seem to be actively run off from our church as if we're trying to get rid of them? Are we not going to do anything about this? Are we not going to invest in what it takes to breathe new life into this thing? Because we're on the path to death. I feel like if nothing changes, the congregation's going to die." Well, admittedly, I probably handled that very poorly. I felt a deep conviction, like a message that I needed to say, and I don't feel that profound conviction very often. I feel like I stepped out and followed this conviction where it led, but I was an angry, awkward teenager, and I probably did a terrible job. And their reaction to it was terrible. They were all angry with me. I poked the wound, and none too gently. And so when that was the reaction I got, I realized there's no hope for me here. There was another Wesleyan church in my town, and so sometimes I went and joined their youth program, but I didn't know anyone there. And that's a particular challenge for me. Once I have a foot in the door with a person, then I'm fine. But when it's a brand new, connection, I just find that exhausting. I'm particularly bad at it. So there wasn't much incentive for me to keep going there. But actually, that was where I got the majority of my exposure to all the crazy end times nonsense, right?
so this
because they showed us all the horrible movies and all that.
Was this the Left Behind era of things, and somewhere along that timeline when that was really popular?
It was before those were coming out, but the same kind of theology. So for instance, this one movie we watched, I don't even remember what it's called. It was, the production values were pretty bad, but also it just felt oppressive and dark, like there's no hope for anything. Because of course that's the idea, is that there isn't hope. And it left me with this feeling that, impending doom. It's a cliched phrase, but that's precisely what it is. And honestly, that's the exact same feeling of depression. Obviously people experience depression in many different ways, but a sense of impending doom is very common, and that's certainly how I experienced it. And so eventually that clued me in that maybe something was wrong with that way of thinking. Anyway, That was where I got most of my exposure with that. But again, that's not a place I could stay. Um, I had this friend who is also named Blake, but he's a much less interesting and reliable guy. But he was my friend, and he went to church further away. Um, but I would go there when I would visit him and get a connection with the pastor there, who was younger than most pastors I had known. Um, he took an interest in us, and there was another younger guy there who was really struggling in his life and found a lot of reassurance in his faith, and that's when he became a very strong Christian. And so he sort of took us under his wing also, trying to mentor us, which is interesting when his life is in disarray also, but he was able to share some interesting wisdom with us because of that. And so even though it wasn't really a youth group, we were two teenage guys who had sort of been taken on by these two, relatively young men. And that made a huge difference. In fact, I remember when I was 17, realizing that I hadn't been baptized yet. And I started asking around, why haven't I been baptized? Isn't that something that should have happened? Nobody even asked me. And I remember my pastor said to me that there's this community baptism that will be happening sometime later in the summer, which sounded like a horrifying thing for me. And I had just realized I hadn't been baptized. I felt this pressure to do it. This is something that has been lax apparently, and I want to resolve it. So I went to this other church with my friend, and Pastor JP of all things. And I said, JP, I realized I hadn't been baptized, and I'd like to be. And so he said, all right, come by the house and we'll talk. And he baptized me that Sunday. It was that simple. Why couldn't it be that simple? Those were my frustrations.
Mm-hmm. Is that something?
When I found a place that took things took my concerns seriously, that was home for me then.
Yeah. Is that something? And this is a more general question. Is that something that is a side effect of the Wesleyan denomination? Because I feel like the sacraments are, from what I know of it, they're pretty low on the priority list. I think communion once every quarter. I've never witnessed a Wesleyan baptism at any service I've been to. So, and I came from, Methodist, which you have to be baptized before you're confirmed, and there's communion once a month. So they're not much better. But was that a side effect, or did your pastor just not think it was important? I think it was poor, incredibly poor form for someone to turn away someone eager to be baptized. That doesn't seem like the right stance to take. So,
yeah,
I'm actually just fishing for information as well here, into what either whether that was something from that individual's perspective, or if it was something institutional.
Yeah, it seems to me that even if the sacraments aren't held as highly, that if someone is expressing an interest, expressing a desire, that it's probably not something that we should deflate or deflect.
Absolutely, I agree.
However, my understanding is Wesleyan denomination was formed through mergers, and some of the groups that merged were from significantly different backgrounds and had different approaches to sacrament. And so what was officially accepted in the Wesleyan Church was pretty broad sometimes. And so, and I didn't learn this until later, that, and this may not be true of all Pilgrim Holiness congregations, but my understanding was that the Pilgrim Holiness didn't practice sacraments.
Mm.
And so this congregation was formerly Pilgrim Holiness. So even though the pastors were, they were Wesleyan pastors and they had just come in, as pastors do, but the congregation had a history of more or less neglecting the sacraments, though they wouldn't have, called it neglect.
Hmm. So moving on, you can feel free to interrupt me with if moving chronologically doesn't work for you. I'm just kind of moving along in your story a little bit. So you're 17, you have this compulsion to and a desire to be baptized. It's not met at your home church. You go to your mentor, and your mentor baptizes you, and that experience, that was that part edifying? I mean, to be heard and to be acknowledged in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I mean, it timed out in a funny way because that Sunday happened to be my 18th birthday. And I don't recall, I'm guessing that probably factored into how eager I was to be baptized. But that's just a guess. But yeah, my parents hadn't really been attending church for a while, and they actually drove up considerably out of their way to go to this other church that Sunday and be there when I was baptized. And it's a little funny. Apparently, the last person who had been baptized there, they had forgotten to turn the water heater on. So the water was ice cold.
Oh, no.
So they had made sure to get the water heater on well ahead of time this time, but they forgot to turn it off. So the water was painfully hot. And
oh, my goodness.
We rearranged the nuts and bolts of how we were going to actually carry out the baptism so that I would be in the water for the shortest time possible. And still I was beat red for hours afterwards.
Oh my goodness.
And I actually felt good about that. I took that with me. And I remember my parents drove a Suburban, and after church, I was sitting in the back seat of their Suburban, and the windows were down, and my skin was kind of tingling, and bright red. And the sun was bright, and breathing was easy, and it's one of the lighter times I remember in my life.
Oh, that's wonderful. I
don't know. I mean, I wish I could put significance to that, like I felt, this was removed from me or some other change. I couldn't really put any substance to it. It just felt good. That was it.
Yeah. That can be enough.
Yeah.
So that's a wonderful story from beginning to end there. So, did you go straight from high school to college? Did you have any period in between, or did you just jump straight into it?
I jumped straight into it, and honestly, intellectually, I was fine, but personally, emotionally, I wasn't ready. I didn't know how to cope or adjust. And so the time came to go, and I knew how to get there, but I didn't know where I was going or what I was supposed to do when I got there. And I remember having loaded stuff into my crappy old station wagon, and I was getting ready to leave. And I remember standing around in front of my parents saying, "All right, well, I think I'm about to leave." And I got no response from them.
Hmm.
I don't know what I was looking for, but I thought there should be something. And I mean, I barely got a wave goodbye. And I got in my car and drove off, and I felt so lost. And earlier that summer, I had happened to go on this goofy camping thing, like a wilderness survival trip. We went to an island in Michigan, and we stayed on the island for a week with, few supplies and all that. And I made a great connection with this guy named Bruce. Bruce was a big dude, like just tall and strong and fit, and he was smart. And I made a connection with him. And so for the next year or two, I wasn't getting any kind of emotional support from my parents. So when I needed something, I just drove out to the camp to see Bruce. And he ended up giving me all of his old Greek texts, and I would help him out with whatever was going on around the camp. And never failed, whenever I would pull up, he would say, "I wondered who was going to help me with this," you know. I don't know if he said that to make me feel good or what. But yeah, so the camp was on the way. So I was lost. So instead of going to school, I just went to see Bruce. And I said, "Well, I'm on my way out there. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know what this is going to be like." And he just said, "You'll be fine. Just go." and it wasn't much, but it was so much more than what I got from my parents. And so I went. It was fine. Kind of fine.
Yeah.
Because I still went home on the weekends, because I still kept going back for what I wasn't getting. And it took me at least a year to realize that I don't feel better when I go back home. I feel worse. It just renews my depression. So I'm better off if I don't go. That's a hard realization to make.
Yeah, and as a young person, really just first time away for a long time. Yeah, that's difficult. So, so you have this family dynamic that you're working out. What was school like? You were a philosophy major. Did you enroll and stay as a philosophy major? Did you do any major changes in major or anything like that early on, or did you know even before you went that you wanted to study philosophy and pursue that?
It's funny. Up until the last minute, I was almost a music major. I don't know why I held on to that as long as I did. I mean, I love music, and I'm not too bad at it, but I'm not very disciplined. I wasn't going to go anywhere with that. And I was interested in philosophy, but when I first went, I was just a Christian ministries major. Because I didn't have much to go on, but I had many people talk to me about the possibility of ministry, and the sense I had in when I was listening to my heart, I didn't realize that's what I was doing at the time. But the sense I had was that I wouldn't be satisfied in my life doing anything less than what I felt was the most important thing. And the most important thing at the time, I phrased in a very religious way. but could have easily have been, just existentialism. If I hadn't been religious, it's the issue of the ultimate concerns in life, the big questions, and so it didn't take me long to realize that a Christian ministries major, wasn't going to allow me to engage the things that I wanted to engage. For a short time, I was a triple major: Christian ministries and religion philosophy and biblical literature. And then you actually eventually have to apply to be accepted as a Christian ministries major. And I was one of the few students they rejected. I don't even remember why. I just remember
I never even heard that.
Yeah.
In all my time in that building, I did not know that was a thing, and I did not know that they would reject someone either.
I think that
both of those things are actually completely new information for me.
I don't think that it was something that was talked about much because no one worried about it. No one was ever rejected. I was rejected, and I mean, I remember sitting down with one of the professors he was one who I respected a lot, and he was telling me that they weren't going to accept me. Yet he said, maybe sometime in the future we can try this again, but as of right now, we're not going to accept you. And looking back on it, of course they shouldn't have accepted me. I was in a very bad place at the time. I was a wreck. You don't want to send personal disasters out into the world as young pastors. You don't want to do that for their own sake. Not to mention all of the people who will be affected by their attempts to be ministers. So I should have been rejected. So I'm glad I was. And that forced me to reconsider some things. I ended up dropping the major, and shortly after I dropped the major, that professor asked me back into the office and said, "Hey, we want to accept you to the major now." And I was like, well, some things have changed. So egg on your face, I guess.
Oh my goodness.
But no, he was very gracious about it and laughed about it. And I was even then I was able to be thankful that I was rejected, because I had already realized that the shift toward philosophy and religion was a very good decision for me.
Okay. Well, I mean, then hindsight being 2020, that's a very good thing. So, was it either during college or any time leading up to it, did you start to experience some sort of either cognitive dissonance, emotional dissonance, or some sort of crisis of faith between what you were learning and the sort of behaviors and beliefs that you saw either lived out on campus or lived out on, within your church family or elsewhere, that you saw people that called themselves Christians acting? This is kind of the turning point, and kind of what these conversations what these conversations are really about is how people come into this world and how they live in it for a while, and then a period of examination sometimes happens.
Yeah.
So, what was that for you?
This is one of the
And it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be like one thing either. I know, for me personally, it was a culmination of, like a very strong element of, political conflation with theology, conservative politics, especially on campus, within the history department. I was a double major when I first started as a history and biblit majors. And then I added a writing major and dropped the biblit to a minor near the end. But most of my work was in history, and a lot of my work was in history, and even some, church history courses counted. And within the social sciences department, it was just extremely overrun with conservative thinking that was unabashed and encouraged. And the alternatives were squashed before they had a chance, which for me was one of the pivotal things that made me start to examine the overall culture. And I know that for some people, other elements of Christian college campus life, like curfews and open dorm hours and all that other little legalism stuff that creeps into life, those things make you question or can frustrate you, or however you want to phrase it. How did that kind of manifest in your life? Was it at college or elsewhere or after? Well, what was that like?
This is one of the most important moments in my life. And until recently, it was very difficult for me to talk about. There was a lot of pain associated with it. Now I feel like I have some distance. I've processed this many times in many ways. And recently, I'm actually rethinking it a bit. I'm approaching this time in my life from a different angle. So I'll share that as best I can, but with the caveat that it's fresh and I'm still exploring this. Side note, I actually, while we were there, the oppressive conservative climate, especially coming out of the poli-sci department, the history department, really turned me off. I was already associating this conflation of religion and politics as a horrible thing, extreme conservatism as a very bad thing, because those are the things we were seeing. Especially, I saw what it did to the people who were wrapped up in that way of thinking. They were very unpleasant to be around, and so that simple test meant a lot to me, and it still does. I feel like one of the early convictions of Christians, as they engaged classical culture, is that truth and beauty and the good are all the same thing. And so if you have something you think is true, but it is neither beautiful nor good, then it isn't true, or at least it isn't true as it could be. And so that sense of what you believe shapes you into a certain kind of person. And if it makes you an ugly person, then those beliefs are ugly and probably not true. I was in the early stages of developing those convictions. But for me, this questioning of the evangelical, or for me at the time, the entire Christian perspective on life, came in a very different way. And it's because of my exposure to faith and my exposure to mental illness and my mom. I'll try to capture that briefly, because it's a bit of that is necessary. My mom has borderline personality disorder. And so I don't really blame her for a lot of this, but it did give me a lot of issues to work through. And that's difficult to explain to someone who hasn't experienced that disorder. But they don't make personal connections very well. They don't have a sense of empathy. They're very concerned with their own security. They're likely to use the people around them as tools to create security for themselves, regardless of the effect that it has on those other people. Outside my family, everyone thought my mom was sweet and nice. and they still kind of do. But inside, nothing was guaranteed. Nothing was sacred. I couldn't trust what was being said. What I was being given as love was something very controlling and very manipulative, very abusive. And as I said before, a lot of that would come through with religious language. So even though now I can look back and say, all of this was my mom's mental illness, not the religious environment I grew up in, at the same time, it gave me a lot of religious baggage because, she would say things in her particular ways. So she would quote, "Be sure your sins will find you out," right? But what she meant was, you will be exposed. And it contributed to that sense of impending doom, and was a very effective tool for controlling my behavior when I was young. So even up until recently, I would very quickly collapse into guilt and shame. And that was the perfect way to shut me down and to control me. So when I arrived in Indiana Wesleyan, I'm already fighting against a certain kind of religious thinking that wasn't necessarily something I could assign to the religious environment I grew up in. I couldn't make that distinction at the time. What I was saying at the time was, Christianity, as it's been to me, was an ugly thing. And if I'm going to remain Christian, I need to dismantle this. I need to start cutting away everything that's ugly and cancerous about this if I'm ever going to save my faith. And I can't say that has anything to do, or at least very much to do, with the congregation I grew up in, or the theology I was given. There is a conflation between the two. Some elements of like the end times thinking and all that stuff, my mother's mental illness, when these things came together, the impact they had was greater than the sum of the parts, So anyway, I'm a young student, and I've got a chip on my shoulder. I am laying waste to everything around me, partly because I don't feel secure. But if I can destabilize the sense of order around me, then I have the upper hand. I know how to behave in that environment. I'm in control. And all of these people who aren't used to that, they suddenly are in control. So it was this weird power trip thing I had. But also, anytime I ran into an element of religious practice or language or belief that was reminiscent of this ugly, abusive thing I was fighting against, then I would set out to destroy it. And I didn't realize the extent to which I was dismantling my own faith. I was tilting at dragons. You know what I mean? I wasn't fighting something real in the world around me. I was fighting my own inner religious demons. And I remember a professor saying to me after my big crash that this was leading up to, "We were watching you dismantle this thing, and we were all worried about how far it would go." And I remember early one week, some thoughts started to creep into the back of my mind, and I immediately panicked and shoved them away, and I refused to think about them. And ever so often, they would creep back into my mind. And then I remember, I think it was a Friday morning at the end of that week, I was sitting in my ethics class, and all of a sudden, all of that hit me full force. and I didn't believe anymore. And I wanted to, but I couldn't make it happen. And what I experienced was some of the worst grief I've ever experienced in my life. Because I wasn't just dealing with a loss of faith. I was also dealing with all of the abuse around the necessity of belief. And that if it happens to be that this is all true, and now I can't make myself believe, then I'm lost. I'm doomed. And if it happens to be that it's not true, then everything that I've built meaning to in my life is also false. And my life has no meaning. I'm not anchored in anything anymore. I don't know who I am or what I'm doing. And I was walking through my days utterly empty. I was still on a path toward ministry, but I couldn't make myself believe. And that was a place of just the deepest despair. I lost a lot of weight during that period of my life. My grades were just horrible. I was a very, very bad friend. And that's when I had one of my first unexplained moments. I call it a miracle or a mystical encounter. And it's the most absurd story possible. The dumbest thing a person could ever hope to have as a story. And I think that is intentional. I think I was given an absurd thing for a reason. Because what that did was it conditioned how I would come back into the faith. Because my journey back into the faith is a journey out of cynicism and into being vulnerable with my heart, being honest about my intuition. What my heart knows is true, whether my mind believes it or not. And those themes have become so central to my faith. But it all began in this ridiculous little moment where as soon as it happened, I said, I am not going to believe that. Very, very soon, I won't believe that happened. Right? And so I was forced to either trust my heart, I know that it happened, and I know what that means, regardless of the disaster that my mind is in. And that was the beginning of cleaning up my mind and rebuilding. And eventually, I was able to start believing a little bit again. But that was a very long and painful process.
Wow. Yeah, that's so you felt that you were able to you went through all of that while you were in college. Like all of that happened within the time span that you were at school. You had this rapid you had this buildup of a lot of emotional pain. You're learning a lot about, you're mainlining all these philosophical and theological ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have what you say is you refer to as your crash. And then you began rebuilding as well, like right with that early work of reconstructing your faith. Mm-hmm. That started in college as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. A little difficult to explain, but the event that actually culminated in this moment where I couldn't believe was the summer between my freshman and sophomore year at Indiana Wesleyan. My girlfriend broke up with me. We'd been dating for like 2.5 years. It was ridiculous, for someone that age. But she was still in high school. She should have broken up with me long before she did. But I was compensating for lack of affection from a mom, right? So I had this inordinate attachment to her, and I didn't want to let go of her. So kudos to her for being brave and doing the necessary thing and breaking it off. I had so much respect for her, even as that sent me into a tailspin emotionally. So I was already emotionally destabilized. Now I'm having to deal with the absence of whatever I expected to get from my mother because I don't have a cushion against it. So I was in an emotionally frail state. And then I'm right back in the academic environment. And I attacked all of that with great intensity. I didn't shy away from the difficult ideas. Maybe I should have, to be gentle with myself, but I didn't. And so it was mostly my sophomore year where I was in this very dark place, and that's when I was rejected when I applied to, be a CM major and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And junior year was when I finally could start rebuilding. And I was a new person then. I had stopped going to see my parents, and I had started building much stronger relationships with the other philosophy and religion guys, and the entire context of my life changed. So I still had a lot of questions and a lot of struggling, but I was rebuilding. And that doesn't mean that I was comfortable or stable in my faith, because I've always struggled with a deep cynicism. I'm a skeptical person to begin with, and I think a certain amount of skepticism is healthy. And I teach a certain skeptical attitude to my congregants now. Be skeptical, ask questions, don't trust all of this garbage that's being given to you. It's beautiful. However, in me, coupled with my burden and the darkness I had to fight against and all of my questions and the way all of that mixed in me, I didn't have anything resembling a stable, healthy faith for years. But I was happier.
And that's certainly a good starting place to rebuild that.
Yeah.
So I mean it's very difficult. It's very difficult to build anything healthy when you're deeply unhappy.
Absolutely. I think there's a connection between trauma and belief. Some people appear to go deeper into a belief with trauma, but that's not generally the kind of belief that I want people to have, that I think is healthy. Genuine belief has everything to do with healing trauma. We're able to see the world differently when we begin to work through all of that stuff. And belief is only possible when we're letting go of that which is clouding our vision, which is a lot of hurt and darkness and pain and real stuff. But they're less true than the opposite.
Yeah. So when you started to rebuild your faith, and you were doing this within the context of a place that exemplified some of the things that you had worked to personally reject, what did you replace those things with that you had resolved that for you personally were not representative of your understanding of Christianity and of philosophy in general? Because I do remember having some conversations with you and some other philosophy majors that technically theology could be a subset of philosophy. I don't know if you still believe that, but that was definitely a college discussion I remember from way back when now. But what did you, when you went through this process, this deeply personal, this deeply painful thing, and then you are slowly working to reconstruct things, what when it comes to because when it comes to just kind of the types of belief that you now gravitate towards, because a lot of what a lot of a big part of evangelicalism is tied into, you know, there a semblance or an idea of orthodoxy and or like of believing something, even if the word orthodoxy isn't the word that is used. It's still the meaning that's being carried is that you have a certain type of correct belief. But you you had gone through this process where you began to realize that the things that did not describe the sort of God you wanted to believe in, or the religion, or the type of behavior you wanted to emulate. What was the what were the beliefs, or what type of teachings really started to speak to you in that time and today? So now we can kind of, we can also, open this up to your experience after college. We don't have to just talk about college here, but any time after having gone through that period where you recognized that within the confines of this particular realm of belief, you didn't find what you needed. Where did you find it?
That's a very difficult question. Primarily because I didn't have a lot of easily expressible convictions. I would say from the time I started to rebuild my faith, the later years of college and the following years, there was very slow growth for me. In fact, the couple years immediately following graduation, one of my friends affectionately called the lost years because I disappeared. And I was still in Marion, but I wasn't in communication with anyone. I wasn't reading. I wasn't engaging anything. I was working a terrible job, and my life was going nowhere. I literally lived on a dead-end street, which I didn't recognize as being a significant metaphor until much later. But the times when your life isn't going anywhere are often the time when tremendous work under the surface is being done. And it's true. I was working through a lot of old stuff and still letting go. I had a lot of stuff to let go of. So all my friends had gone on to grad school or seminary. I wasn't going anywhere because I wasn't ready. I didn't have a faith that could handle academic rigor again. I didn't have a heart that was ready for it. And so it's very difficult for me to conceptualize in any kind of intellectual way what was happening with my faith. I don't know that I was replacing all of the old stuff with much that was new in a concrete way. I was mostly still cleaning out all of the garbage. I was progressively letting go of old ideas and old attitudes. And the nascent faith that was growing, that was new, I was having to protect it carefully. because if I read the wrong thing on the wrong day, if I wasn't doing well one day and I read something hyper skeptical, then I would, I'd be back to square one again. And eventually I learned how to bounce back from that and work through it. Um, I was just so fragile that I didn't have a lot to show for my work. Um, all of that was necessary groundwork for what came much later. And much later, really, I mean the last 4 years of my life. Only in the last 4 years of my life have I begun to find a theological home. And only in the last year, just the last year, have I been able to um, put into language what my deepest convictions are. I had them before, more or less, but they were mixed in with the old. They didn't have a life of their own yet, and they hadn't crystallized into something I could communicate very well. Which, by the way, if you can't communicate your convictions as a pastor, that puts you in a difficult spot. You're probably not a very good pastor, and I wasn't. So yeah, when we're talking about like, what have I replaced that with? Well, I mean, replacement. I don't know of a better word for it, but I don't know if replacement is a good word either for whatever I was doing. I was being restructured into a person who was relatively human and healthy. Um, one of my friends calls it becoming a real boy, and I mean it. I feel human, and I don't relate to the person I was before that long process. I don't understand that person very well anymore, and the process of moving from that person to who I am now is very cloudy. I don't have a lot of concepts and categories for it. It's almost like the way you don't store memories well when you're a very young child, because you just haven't had enough, enough experience to build concepts to be able to even process the memories. And in a way, spiritually, that's where I was at, I think. And so in the last 4 years, I was convinced that I should go on to seminary. So I started seminary. And
Is that when you also started working as a pastor as well?
No.
In the last 4 years, or?
I started pastoral work just 2 years out of college. And I didn't want to. But I had started dating a girl and attended her church some because I was just floating. And they were in need of a part-time associate pastor. And they were looking for someone, but they didn't know how to look or find. And they said, "You have the education, you do it." And I said, "Okay." Because, I was working at Walmart, not doing anything meaningful with my life. So I said, "Sure, I'll do it." And I was terrible. But being in real community with real people, even if we were on very different pages theologically, did have a lot to do with shaping me and forcing me to work through some of my baggage and my behavior. Taught me how to actually be considerate and compassionate toward people. So, no, I started pastoral work early, and I got the better end of it. However, what I did start at the same time as I started seminary, well, I was only a couple years into social work, as a side career. It ended up becoming my primary, career, I guess. I'd been doing social work, decided to go to seminary, and then I became actively involved with the little monastery in the next town over. And I mean, we call it a monastery, but it's a mother house for a small like convent community. They're missionary sisters, and when they retire from their missionary work, mostly in the Southwest, they come live here. And so it's an amazing place to go because, on one hand, there's the typical monastery convent environment, beautiful grounds, very peaceful, but also all of these elderly women who have spent their entire lives in service to the poor. And they will have an impact on a person. And they're exactly what I needed, especially since the way I got involved there was studying the mystical tradition, and then entering into a spiritual direction practice where I was receiving spiritual direction, and I was being taught and trained in spiritual direction. I had someone who was mentoring me in giving spiritual direction, and then I had to begin offering spiritual direction to others. So it was a very holistic approach to this, and combined with seminary exposing me to new theological conversations, engaging the mystical tradition, but also having this tremendous formative experience personally. It's I don't have words for it. I just don't. But I feel like I have crystallized. I have become who I actually am in the last few years. I understand myself. I see my story for what it is, and I don't identify with my story so much. And I have more peace, and I'm happier. I'm a more effective pastor. And eventually, through that process, I was able to begin verbalizing what my new convictions are. But that was the last thing that happened.
Yeah, and I mean that as your story indicates, that sort of development takes time, and given where you are now, and given the overall context of this program, what do you think is a larger priority now, for you and the way and engaging with the mystical tradition, and maybe you can speak to a little more particulars in regards to that and how that might, for someone that may come from an evangelical background, but doesn't have that particular experience. What does that branch of the Christian faith, what does that offer? What does that teach? What does that offer for your sense of being, or you, as you said, you feel more crystallized now, and I don't, and this is another word you said that was very good was, this is being a holistic thing. Mm-hmm. This was something for you that was deeply personal, deeply interconnected. With that in mind, is that something, within that part of your journey, what did that teach you, or what has that developed within you, that would be that would be good for someone that hasn't had that experience to hear, regardless of whether they come from an evangelical background or not. What would be good for them to hear about that?
Right. Well, I want to say so much in response to this question. I should only say the things that are the most important, but I want to say so much.
Well, we can have more than one conversation if you'd like. If you'd like, we can have more than one conversation, and we can even be more targeted than this.
Sure.
But right now we're getting your story, Stephen.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, and I think that's key here, because I can talk about, the mystical tradition in general, or the theological schools that I've been engaging, and the benefits and why they matter and all that. But what matters here in this discussion is the change in me and what was significant in that. If I were to try to conceptualize the 2 or 3 most significant holistic events for me that have come out of my experience with the mystical tradition and spiritual direction, what would those things be? That's sort of how I'm phrasing your question for myself. Is that fair?
That's absolutely fair. Yes,
Okay.
I was working through that question even as I was saying it. So that's a very good rephrasing of my question.
Okay. Well, this is good because these things, in some ways, seem a bit disconnected, but I promise they are not. All of these things hit at the very root of my very identity and how I've lived my entire life, and why I'm able to live differently now. And in fact, it may be difficult for me to say them without crying a bit. Let's see what happens. The holistic really is the key word, because I'm a person who, in response to the demands of the world, and especially in dark circumstances, I retreated into my mind. I'm an intelligent person, and I could engage with things in my mind and distance my heart and perhaps even shut it down, and I could stay more safe. Especially since, with a mentally ill mom who used emotion to control and abuse, any amount of emotional vulnerability was dangerous. That would be used against me, and so I had a deep mistrust of the world, and a deep mistrust of experience, and that blended with the kind of evangelicalism I was raised with. One of the things I used to say once this clicked for me was that every sermon I heard about joy was a sermon against happiness. And it's totally true, not an exaggeration, because every time they would praise joy and lift joy up as a Christian virtue, they would say, joy is not happiness. But wait a second. Happiness is a very good marker of joy, right? But I was taught to not trust my happiness, right? That's dangerous. And I think that dynamic isn't just true of happiness and joy. It's true of a lot of things with Christianity, at least like conservative evangelical Christianity. The things that are the best in life are also really dangerous, and you probably shouldn't engage them. And that's not entirely wrong. We protect the most important things in life, or the most powerful things in life, by putting boundaries around them to protect ourselves from those things and to preserve a certain sacredness around those powerful things. Boundaries around those things are good. I mean, even as a society, even on a secular level, we've learned that, just uncontrolled sexuality is actually a very dangerous and destructive thing. So putting boundaries around sexuality is really important and valuable. However, we could really go overboard with that stuff. And it's like the story that I mentioned where my grandma slapped the cards out of my hand in church because cards are associated with gambling and I was doing them in church, right? Like, the boundaries around these things become so absurd that they impede the living of life. Okay. So when I spend time with the mystical tradition, and I was forced to engage my actual experience of the world and to learn to be present to my own self, to be aware of what my own experience in the moment is, because I'll disengage from that and be in my mind. But to dwell in my body, to feel my body where it's at, and to notice. What am I noticing in myself? What am I noticing in the world around me? And not allowing my mind to run off with that and make associations and begin processing. Just accept the moment for what it is, accept what I'm noticing for what it is, and be okay with that. Accept those things as gifts, not to be dissected and thereby destroyed. Like, I can understand them, but now they're dead. But to allow them to be alive and to engage them as a holistic human person in an environment, not as a disembodied mind, which was my old tendency. So when I began doing that means you have to trust your experience a bit. And one of the nuns, one of the sisters, one of the most profound moments in my life, she made this simple observation. Who was Jesus? Jesus was the one who spoke with his own authority. That's what other people noticed in him, was not that he cited all the other sages and authorities. He spoke with his own authority, which means he trusted his own experience of who God was. And so if we are following Jesus, we need to be the people who trust our experience of who God is. That was mind-blowing for me. Trusting our experience of who God is. Because that means my intuition about who God is can engage the voice of tradition as an equal. I don't have to just accept the orthodoxy handed to me. I don't have to reject it out of hand. I can engage with it as if I have a certain authority, because I do have a certain authority. Not that I'm an authority over tradition, but I am the one who is aware of my intuitions of who God is. And when my intuitions of who God is resonate with those who have devoted their lives to that intuition of who God is, and we're resonating on the same frequency, we have the same or similar experiences of who God is, then that's something that can be trusted. And so that leads me to the number one thing, which is this Karl Rahner quote, a Catholic theologian, and it's it's a quote that I keep coming back to all the time. In the future, Christians will either be mystics or they won't exist at all. Meaning, we will either collectively rediscover that an actual encounter with the divine in a holistic, experiential way is the cornerstone of what it means to be Christian, or all of this other stuff is going to collapse because it's built on nothing. because I'm not the only skeptic. I'm not the only cynic. Our culture is increasingly skeptical and cynical. At least in our little slice of time, that's where we're moving. And my story is the story of a person being called out of cynicism and into a skeptical but honest approach to faith. And that means I engage all the intellectual questions, and I know all the reasons why I shouldn't believe what I believe. But I also have this experience. And if I trust that, I can have a certain peace in my faith despite all my questions. That can be a little tenuous, but I think that's the genuine experience of faith. It means wrestling with the world as it is, and wrestling with the religious tradition handed to me. And for me, as a pretend Bible scholar, wrestling with the text, studying and engaging in this in as deep a way as I can, and refusing to let go of one or the other. I want to hold it all together in tension, and also be able to set it aside and just be me in the moment with my experience of who God is.
Mm-hmm.
And what that leads me to is the final thing, if we have enough time for that.
We do.
The final most significant thing I've gotten from my engagement with the mystical tradition. I was on a silent retreat, and I was in a dry place with my prayer. Not only was I didn't feel like I was getting any kind of response or experience, I also felt like I wasn't able to be present in my own prayer. I didn't know what I was doing, much less what God was doing. And so I was just kind of trying different things to see if I could get some traction. And at this location, there's an outdoor Stations of the Cross. So I was walking up the Stations of the Cross, this ravine. It's beautiful in the woods, and I couldn't even appreciate the beauty of the woods. I was so frustrated. At this point in my life, I was having to experience again working through some of the trauma from my mom, because it's the onion thing. Every so often you realize, oh, there's a little bit more that I could work through and release. I was doing that, and my marriage was falling apart at the same time. We were facing an imminent divorce. And so those two patterns of how, like, my own personal complications with engaging the feminine, right? Reapproaching trauma from my mom, and then letting go of my wife, and feeling very guilty about that. I'm walking up the Stations of the Cross, and I'm no stranger to them. So I'm not engaging just the surface level stories, or at least they're not having that emotional impact that they often do. And I don't even remember what scene or what station it was, but the scene before me involved Mary. Mary was present, and the ever-present love of Mary, the one who doesn't have to endure suffering herself, but also doesn't abandon the one who suffers, walks alongside him the whole way, right? Shares in the suffering. And I remember saying out loud, which I'm on a silent retreat, but I just say out loud with far more venom than I realized would come, to the Jesus who's carrying his cross, I say, at least you had a good mom, Jesus. And I laughed because, you develop a dark sense of humor about religion and all of this stuff when those are your experiences. I laughed. And then later on, I realized that actually was cutting to the heart of everything. And it was the figure of Mary who helped me realize what it means to be accepted and loved and safe, welcome, you know. And it came through this. I had, I don't know if you want to call it a vision. I didn't see it. It was something I saw in my mind, right? It was an imagining, but it was a significant imagining, I guess. I wasn't creating it myself, I think. I have trouble with anxiety and some tics, right? And so if my anxiety is high and I'm ticking a lot, that drives me crazy, and sometimes it'll drive other people crazy. There isn't a whole lot that other people can do to help me in that moment. But one thing that people can do is just be beside me and silently put a hand on my shoulder. And I will instantly calm down. Because that kind of silent presence, accepting physical touch that's safe, but establishes a certain kind of intimacy, somehow cuts to the root of my anxiety, right? And I saw Mary do that with me so that I could enter the presence of God, right? And I was engaging with God using all this feminine imagery of mother and lover, as the one who's willing to accept me, not reject me. And I was reminded of the overtold story of the prodigal son. And I realized the whole point of the prodigal son story isn't the son who leaves or the son who stays. They're both kind of assholes. And neither of them is terribly repentant at the end of the story. And the father doesn't care. The father welcomes them both home and just wants them to be home. And presumably, repentance comes once you're at home being welcomed. And I suddenly realized what a lie I was told with all of my old evangelical theology, that God can't be in the presence of sin. Bullshit. The very point of the incarnation is that God enters into the very heart of sin, and it's not a threat. God is not threatened by sin. The whole point of everything is that God can forgive sin because God's not threatened by it. And the fact that you might be struggling with sin has nothing to do with God's ability and willingness and desire to welcome you into his presence. And that was when I was finally able to let go and allow myself to be welcomed into the presence of God and actually experience God and yada, yada, yada. Everything comes from that.
Wow, that's incredibly powerful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
That's yeah, I mean, I'm at a loss for words, to be completely honest. I'm definitely lost in my own mind, really just kind of thinking through all of the things you've said, especially about that moment, and having all of those things arrive in your mind and in your heart at once must have been something else entirely. So, I I honestly don't think we could leave on a much higher note than that. as far
Yeah.
as closing out this closing out the interview portion here, because that really speaks to everything, for lack of a better word. So,
And I
thank you
think
very
that's
much. Thank you. What's that?
sorry. I think that's one of the reasons
Go ahead.
why I wanted to champion this project of yours. You know, um, I wanted to see it come about because this is the conversation to have. I mean, you're having it in a very specific way, um, but this is exactly what needs to be engaged. You know, um, I saw myself in your project, and I wanted it to happen. Aside from the fact that
Well, aside from the fact that what?
aside from the fact that I believe in your project, you know.
Well, I mean that absolutely. That as I mentioned before, that your constant encouragement over the last couple of years has definitely meant a lot. Uh, but yeah, I mean that's exactly these are the stories that I am looking for. That these are the things that you arrive at an understanding that's greater than the one that was given to you.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially,
Yeah.
You were, I don't know, evangelicalism in general has a sort of a veneer. It, when you, it, they give you certain expressions of it. There isn't much thought to it, and then once you dive into the thoughts, they're not very satisfactory. But and I think part of it is that it isn't, and this is part of my own exploration as well, is that it feels like it's addressing only a tiny sliver of the human experience and of our understanding of divinity.
Right.
And I mean, and that, and not wanting to end on a negative note, but on the positive note that you so eloquently put, that God is there amidst the sin, amidst all those things. That is such a revelatory thing to consider. And I thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that story. And I hope that people are encouraged by it. I know that I am. So, well, Stephen, thank you so much for talking with me for close to 2 hours now. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, it's been a privilege. I'm glad we connected.
Yeah, absolutely. So we will thank you again for sharing your very personal and very encouraging story. And you have expressed it very beautifully, and I'm very appreciative of it. So I'm glad to know you better. And I hope that people that will hear this episode are encouraged. So thank you.
Absolutely.